Love does not always bloom in sunlight. Sometimes it is born in silence, where shadows breathe and hearts whisper what lips never dare to say. This is the story of Amy and Nathan, two souls who found each other not in the brightness of the day, but in the hidden corners of the night. The city at night was alive but lonely. Cars rushed past, their headlights stretching across empty streets like fleeting promises. Neon signs flickered on and off, bathing the pavement in colors that felt cold instead of warm. Somewhere in this restless darkness, Amy walked with her hands tucked into her coat, her steps quiet against the cracked concrete. She carried a silence around her like armor, each thought pressing heavier on her chest. To her, night was not a time for sleep, but a place where her secrets could hide without judgment. Nathan moved through the same city, but in a different rhythm. He was a man of stillness, drawn to places where the world slowed down. He often found himself at the edge of the river, watching the dark water carry reflections of bridges and street lamps. To him, the river was a mirror, cold, deep, and unspoken, just like his heart. People passed him every day, yet none saw him. He lived in a crowd but remained unseen, like a shadow blending into other shadows. The first time Amy and Nathan's worlds aligned, it was not with words, but with silence. She was standing at a bus stop, her breath visible in the cold night air. The street was nearly empty except for him, leaning quietly against a lamppost a few steps away. Their eyes never met, yet both felt the strange presence of another lonely soul close by. No greetings, no smiles, just the quiet knowledge that someone else carried the same weight in the dark. The night stretched on, and the city continued to hum. But Amy noticed something different. Nathan's stillness was not threatening. It was familiar. It reminded her of herself, of the parts she could not explain to anyone else. In that brief, wordless moment, the shadows around her seemed less heavy. For the first time in months, she felt that maybe she was not the only one who belonged to the dark. Nathan noticed too. He had watched people come and go, always moving too fast, always chasing light. But the way Amy stood there, wrapped in quiet, was different. She was not running. She was simply being, and he understood that. Though they never spoke, he carried her image with him as he left that night. The way her eyes seemed to see something far away, something he himself could not name. It was not love yet, not even friendship. It was only recognition, the subtle spark when two shadows realize they are not alone. And sometimes, that is the beginning of everything. Rain began to fall that night, not heavy, but soft, like the sky was whispering secrets to the ground. The city glistened under it, streets shining as though they were painted with liquid glass. Amy stayed at the bus stop longer than she should have, watching each raindrop ripple in a small puddle near her feet. She felt the air shift, and when she turned her head slightly, she noticed Nathan had not left. He was still there, leaning against the lamppost, his coat damp, his hair catching drops of rain. Yet he didn't move. It was as though he belonged to the night, unshaken by the weather. The bus came and went. Amy did not get on. Neither did Nathan. They stood apart, strangers, yet tied together by a silence that spoke louder than the roaring engines of passing cars. The rain grew steadier, and without thinking, Amy stepped out from under the bus shelter. Nathan's eyes followed her, though she never looked back. She tilted her face toward the sky, letting the water wash across her skin. It was not a cry for help, nor a search for comfort. It was surrender, a moment of letting herself feel. Nathan understood it in a way he could not explain. He too stepped out, letting the rain soak him. No words, no gestures, just two souls letting the storm embrace them. From a distance, they must have looked like strangers caught in bad weather. But in truth, they were two pieces of the same shadow, standing together without needing to bridge the space between them. Amy closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she did not feel invisible. Nathan's presence was quiet, but it was strong. She could sense that he was not watching her out of curiosity, but out of recognition, as if her pain was a language he had always spoken. In that wordless exchange, something delicate began to form. Not love, not yet, but the first fragile threads of connection, invisible and unspoken. The rain eventually slowed. The street emptied, leaving only the hum of distant traffic. Amy turned to leave, but just as she stepped away, Nathan shifted slightly. Not forward, not back, just enough for her to know he noticed her absence. She paused, a silent question hanging between them before she finally walked into the night. Nathan remained, but the emptiness around him no longer felt endless. For the first time in a long while, he felt he had seen someone who carried the same shadows as he did. Someone who understood the language of silence. And though they left without a single word, the night had already bound them together. Days passed, yet the memory of that night stayed with Amy like a song that refuses to fade. She found herself walking the same streets, as if her footsteps were being pulled by an invisible thread. It wasn't longing for a stranger she barely knew. It was the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone in her silence. Every night the city seemed to whisper his presence, even when he wasn't there. Nathan felt it too. His world had always been measured in shadows and distance, but now there was a crack in that rhythm. He would sit by the river longer than before, listening to the soft rush of water, wondering if somewhere Amy was listening too. He had no words for her, yet words were not what tied them. What tied them was the quiet recognition of pain, the unspoken acknowledgement that both carried storms inside their hearts. When they crossed paths again, it was not dramatic. No sudden collision, no planned meeting. It was ordinary, a bookstore tucked on the corner of a nearly empty street. Amy was inside, her fingers brushing along the spines of worn novels, her eyes lost in worlds she did not dare live. Nathan stepped in only to escape the cold. But the moment he saw her, the air changed. He didn't call her name. He didn't even know it. Instead, he stood in the same aisle, a shelf apart, his hand pausing just inches from where hers rested. Neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was alive, breathing with a rhythm that only they could hear. Amy turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for the first time in clear light. There was no surprise in her gaze, no fear, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had been expecting him without knowing why. She did not smile. He did not nod. Yet the moment stretched, filling the room with something stronger than words. The silence became a language, fragile but true, carrying more meaning than any confession could. In that stillness, they admitted what neither could say. That darkness had brought them together, and perhaps it was where they belonged. Amy lowered her hand, closing the book she hadn't read. Nathan stepped back, his expression unreadable, yet his presence lingering like a shadow that refused to disappear. They walked out of the store separately, but the silence followed them both, binding them tighter than if they had spoken. Some loves begin with words. Theirs began with silence, an invisible language only they could understand, spoken not by voices but by the spaces between them. Amy carried secrets like folded letters locked inside her chest. Each day she walked through the city. She wore a mask of calm, but underneath there were wounds she never showed. She had loved once before, and that love had left her broken, teaching her that words could be weapons, and promises could turn to smoke. Silence became her refuge, and darkness her only witness. To let anyone too close was to risk losing herself again, and so she had chosen solitude. Nathan's silence was not the same, yet it mirrored hers in a haunting way. His past was a story he never told. Years of choices he regretted, of dreams abandoned too soon, of people he had pushed away before they could push him first. He carried his regrets not as scars, but as shadows that walked beside him, whispering of the man he might have been. To him, silence was not protection. It was punishment. When they stood near each other, those shadows grew restless, as if their secrets sensed the danger of being seen. Amy would feel it, the trembling pull in her chest, the sharp reminder that if she opened herself, the pain of her past could return. Nathan felt it too. The fear that if Amy ever glimpsed the truth he buried, she would leave like everyone else had. And yet, there was a strange comfort in their shared silence. It was as though they were mirrors reflecting each other's hidden storms. In the quiet moments, the brush of shoulders passing on a narrow street, the lingering glance across a crowded train, They felt both exposed and safe at the same time. But safety in the dark is fragile. It cannot last forever. Amy began to sense the weight in Nathan's stillness, the heaviness in the way his eyes lingered on places far away. She knew it was not just loneliness, it was something deeper, a truth he would not share. Nathan, too, noticed the distance in Amy's voice when she finally spoke a word or two. The way her silence was not empty but filled with ghosts. The connection between them was no longer only comfort, it was also danger. To step closer meant risking everything they had kept hidden. And so they lingered in the in-between, drawn to each other, yet afraid of the light that might reveal what they truly were. Love in the dark is not soft. It is sharp, fragile, and filled with shadows that cannot stay buried forever. The city did not change, but something between Amy and Nathan did. What once felt like safety and silence began to feel like distance. Their meetings, small, unplanned, fragile moments, were no longer enough. Amy felt it first. She wanted to ask him who he really was, why his eyes looked like they carried the weight of years, why his hands trembled ever so slightly when he thought no one was watching. But the words never left her lips. She was afraid that questions might break the delicate thread binding them together. Nathan, too, felt the crack growing. Amy's silence, once comforting, now cut through him like glass. He wanted her to trust him, to open her heart, to let him inside the quiet storm she carried. But he also knew the moment she saw his own shadows, she might turn away. And so he stayed still, hoping that presence was enough. Though deep inside, he knew presence without truth was fragile. It happened on a night when the air was heavy with rain again. They stood together under a bridge as the storm crashed around them. The city above was alive with light and sound, but beneath, it was only them. Two figures caught between shelter and flood. Amy's voice broke the silence for the first time. Just one question. Her words were soft yet sharp, slicing through the air. "Why do you always look like you're waiting to disappear?" Nathan froze. He had no answer he could give her, not one that would not tear open the life he had locked away. His silence this time was not comforting. It was rejection. Amy turned her face, her jaw tightening, her chest rising with unspoken anger. The shadows that had once bound them now pushed them apart. She stepped back into the rain, letting it wash over her like it had on that first night. But this time it was not surrender. It was escape. Nathan reached forward, his hand almost lifting, almost calling, almost confessing. But he did nothing. He stood in the shadows and watched her walk into the storm, knowing he had just let her slip through his hands. The silence that once connected them had changed. Now it was heavy, breaking, full of questions neither dared to answer. And in that silence, love began to tremble, fragile and uncertain, like a flame fighting to stay alive in the wind. Amy did not return to the bridge the next night, nor the night after. Her absence filled the city like an echo. Nathan walked the familiar streets, searching for the places where her presence used to live. The bus stop, the bookstore, the corners where their eyes had once met. But each space felt hollow now, as though the night itself had erased her shadow. He tried to convince himself that distance was safer. If she never saw the weight he carried, she would never walk away. Yet the truth was crueler. She had already left, not because she knew his secrets, but because he refused to let her in. The silence that had once sheltered them was now a wall, taller than either of them could climb. Amy, too, felt the fracture cut deep. She wandered through nights that felt longer than before, her steps restless, her chest heavy. Nathan's stillness, once a mirror, now felt like a void swallowing her whole. She had asked one question, and in his refusal to answer, she found every answer she feared. That he could not choose her. That the darkness he lived in was not a place for two. The image of him lingered in her mind. A man leaning against lampposts, staring at rivers, existing but never reaching. She realized she had fallen for a shadow, and shadows cannot be held. They slip through fingers no matter how tightly one tries to keep them. One night, Amy lit a candle in her room, small and trembling against the dark. She sat by the window watching its flame fight against the wind sneaking through the cracks. In that fragile light, she whispered words she could never tell Nathan, I wanted you to stay." The candle flickered, then went out, leaving her in the same silence she had always known. Nathan, across the city, stood by the river as the water moved endlessly past him. He wanted to believe he could still find her, that their silence was not yet broken beyond repair. But as he looked into the reflection of the night sky, he saw nothing but his own shadow staring back. And for the first time, he admitted to himself that he had lost her. Not through anger, not through betrayal, but through the silence he thought would save him. The breaking point was not loud. It was not a fight, not a storm of words. It was quiet, devastatingly quiet, like the last breath of something that had never been allowed to live fully. Their love had not died in fire. It had drowned in silence. Time passed, but the silence between Amy and Nathan remained. Not a single word was spoken. Yet the memory of what almost was continued to live inside them. They became ghosts in each other's nights, always near in thought, but never again in presence. The city carried on, but for them it would never look the same. Every street, every flicker of neon, every shadowed corner whispered of a love that had begun in darkness and ended in silence. Amy learned to live with the absence, though it pressed against her like a scar she could not hide. She told herself that some hearts are not meant to stay. They are only meant to pass through and remind us that even in the deepest shadows, connection is possible. Nathan's presence had been both a wound and a gift, and though it ended, it had shown her she was not truly invisible. That was enough to keep her walking forward, even if the path was lonely. Nathan, meanwhile, carried her in the quietest places of his soul. He returned to the bridge, the river, the bookstore, each one a monument to a story unfinished. He never said her name, never searched for her face in the crowd. Yet every time he stood in the stillness of night, he felt her beside him, as if the darkness had stitched their souls together, even when distance had torn them apart. Love does not always need a future to exist. Sometimes it lives forever in the past, burning quietly in memory, untouched by time. Amy and Nathan's love never shone in the sunlight, never stood in the open air. It lived in the quiet, in the shadows, in the space between words. It was fragile, unspoken, and incomplete, but it was theirs. And so their story did not end with togetherness. It ended with silence. A silence that was not empty, but full of everything they could never say. Their love remained where it was born, in the dark, where it will burn forever, unseen, but never forgotten.